Have you ever played the famous couples game, maybe at a bridal shower or some event like this? This is where the host will give you the first name of the couple and you have to come up with the other one. So for example, I say Sunny, you say Cher. I say Prince Harry, you say Meghan Markle. This is how it works. And you can also play this game with Bible couples. I say Abraham, you say Sarah. I say Joseph, you say Mary. But perhaps one of the most iconic biblical couples brings us to our next mother of the Messiah that we're going to be talking about today. I say Boaz, you say Ruth. Oh, yes. We all love the story of Ruth and Boaz. It's got all the perfect elements of a made-for-TV movie, right? This beautiful young foreign widow makes her way to the land of the Lord. She's destitute and with empty hands and an empty heart. She makes her way into the work field of none other than Boaz. He is tall, dark, and handsome, and he is faithful to the Lord. She wipes the sweat from her brow. He looks up from his ledger, and their eyes meet. Could it be? Is it love at first sight? Okay, I don't mean to make fun. There really is so much beauty in the story of Ruth and Boaz. But I have to be honest with you. I cringe just a little bit every time I see another book on the shelf with Boaz in the title. Waiting for Boaz, waiting for my Boaz, God, where is my Boaz? I mean, I'm sure the author's hearts are in the right place here, but there's so much historical inaccuracy, or at the very least, there's so much left out. If when you think of the story of Ruth and Boaz, all you think of is about their marriage and their love and their romance. Now, historians will tell you there's so much more to this narrative than just a light breath of fresh air in the midst of so much decline and destruction in the book of Judges that comes before it and the books of the Kings that come after it. The book of Ruth is gritty and real and raw. It's deep and it's painful. It's nuanced. Every time you come to a part of the story of Ruth and you think this is straightforward, this is simple to understand, it's probably got a lot more layers to it than you realize. Some of the realities that we have to grapple with when we read the book of Ruth are things like widowhood and barrenness, patriarchy and the labor force. We see the laws of the faith community and we even get a glimpse of the justice system. And so when you hear these famous names, Ruth and Boaz, if you automatically imagine this lovely romantic interlude, think again. This story is really complex. Now, that said, love is the central theme that I want to point out in this story today. It may not be the kind of love that you automatically think of. And so I want to introduce you to a Hebrew word. And this word is the word hesed. Now, Chesed is used 3 times in the book of Ruth throughout this narrative. And this word really does capture the love that is the backbone of this story. Chesed, it indicates a stance of loyalty or solidarity, leading to actions that go above and beyond the expected norm. So it really is an action word. You don't feel chesed, you do chesed. It's been translated in our Bibles as love, kindness, mercy, loyalty, and failing. And so we're going to lean into this word as we walk through the story of Ruth. And what we're going to call this is covenant kindness. So let's look at the story together and find out where covenant kindness is present. Ruth chapter 1. Here we see an Israelite family that has had to leave Bethlehem due to a severe famine, and they make their way to the land of Moab. They're looking for food or maybe land that they can farm in order to produce food. The husband's name is Elimelech, the wife is Naomi, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, after an undisclosed amount of time, Elimelech dies, and Naomi is left with these 2 sons trying to figure out how to move forward. Well, when these boys come of age, she finds for them Moabite wives, and these are the women by the names of Orpah and Ruth. Now, when we learned about Tamar, we talked about the fact that God has a law against marrying foreign wives. And so this is already problematic, but in this case, it might be even worse, because Moabites were the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot and his incestuous relationship with his daughter. Not good. But also, Moabites worshipped foreign gods, and they were considered enemies of Israel. In fact, we see in Deuteronomy 23 that Mosaic law prohibits Moabites from Israelite worship to the 10th generation. And so you might be asking yourself, why would Naomi have her sons intermarry with these women when she knew it was against God's law? But I wonder if she felt she had no other choice, that upon her husband's death, she feels like she went from living in Moab temporarily to indefinitely. And so what was she supposed to do? Well, whatever the case, the things go from bad to worse because after living there for about 10 years, both of her sons die as well. And in verse 5, we see this in the text. It says, "And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." And I want you to notice here, this phrase is more than just sad. It's more than just unfortunate. This is absolute and utter devastation. Naomi now has nothing. Whatever belonged to her husband, whatever was passed down to her sons, it wouldn't automatically transfer to her. Women had no status in this time and in this place. They had nothing of their own, and they didn't have the power to claim anything as their own. And widowhood and old age might be even worse. Without a father to return to, or sons to take care of her, or even maybe a married daughter to take her in, Naomi is left with very few options here, and none of them are good. And so we see in chapter 1 that Naomi hears that conditions back in Bethlehem have improved. And so she makes the decision to return there. Perhaps something could be done with the land her husband once owned. Maybe there will be a generous relative that would take her in and care for her. So she begins the journey and she tries to convince her daughters-in-law that they should return to their homes in Moab. And Orpah eventually does this, though it does take some convincing. But look at Ruth. She refuses. In chapter 1, verse 16, this isn't Ruth just saying, "I don't want to go home." And this isn't Ruth saying, "I want to go to Bethlehem and see what it's like." This is Ruth making covenant vows to Naomi, promises that will change the course of both of their lives. This is what she says. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Now, there's 2 things that I want to point out from these words. First of all, Naomi has clearly taught her daughters-in-law about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Ruth knows, and she believes. Now, she may not be allowed to worship in the same way that the Israelites are, but this is a confession of faith nonetheless. And so while Naomi maybe didn't get everything right when she lived in Moab, this kind of shows us that her God was still a constant for her. And then we have Ruth's oath. Her vow to die with Naomi and to be buried along with her. This is a declaration that she is now leaving her land and her people and everything she's ever known. And she is saying that Naomi will be her home and her future. Now, this is an incredibly moving scene, but it's more than just heartwarming. I mean, it's a good thing that Ruth is willing to die with Naomi because that very well may be what happens. These 2 women have nothing. I mean, let's just take stock of what we've learned so far, shall we? Okay, both of these women are widowed. Naomi has also lost her sons. Ruth never had any sons. Both of these women have nothing. They're completely destitute. And for the last 10 years, Naomi has lived as a foreigner, and Ruth is about to become a foreigner. But in this moment, when they are looking at each other in their absolute brokenness, it's the gospel that saves their lives. These women, they refuse to give up on one another, and because neither one is willing to think about themselves in this moment, it changes everything. And so as chapter 1 comes to a close, we see the 2 companions arrive in Bethlehem, and Naomi causes quite a stir. It would seem that she's unrecognizable to her old friends, but she's not just unrecognizable to them. She doesn't recognize herself. Look at what it says in verse 20. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Such contrast here. I mean, to add to the list, she was full, but she's coming back empty. She was blessed, but now she feels she's been cursed. And it even comes down to her name. The name Naomi actually means pleasant, but she says in this moment, don't call me that. That no longer applies. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter, because that is a better fit. The grief is real. But friends, oftentimes when we allow ourselves to sit in the gravity of grief, then we get to experience the glory of God. And that's certainly what happens for Ruth and Naomi. So at the beginning of chapter 2, Ruth knows that she's going to have to work hard in order to provide for herself and for her mother-in-law. Now, Mosaic law, it called Israelite landowners to allow gleaners to come into their fields and be provided for. After the grain had been cut by harvesters, which were usually men, then it was gathered into bundles by reapers, who were usually women, and then gleaners were allowed to come into the field and pick up whatever was left on the ground, and that they could take home for their families. Gleaners were typically the poor, widows, orphans, etc. And so this is what Ruth sets out to do. And she just so happens to come to a field owned by, you guessed it, Boaz. And when Boaz comes to check on things in his field, he notices Ruth and he does some investigating. And here's what he finds out. Chapter 2, verse 5. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. And so right here, we see covenant kindness at work again, first in Ruth and then in Boaz. Look what that overseer says about Ruth in verse 7. Ruth asks not to be a gleaner in the field with all of the other poor and the begging. Ruth asks if she could come in before the gleaners. She asks to follow the harvesters directly, picking up full stalks of grain right along with the reapers. She's challenging these men to go above and beyond the letter of the law and to live by the spirit of the law. She is working to provide for Naomi, and she is not going to go home empty-handed. And so how does Boaz respond? He rises to the occasion. He empowers her, he provides for her, and he protects her. In verse 8, we see Boaz empower Ruth by affirming her bravery and asking for something so out of the ordinary. He tells her to stay close to the female reapers. And this is the same word that was used in chapter 1 when she clung to Naomi. He tells her that she's welcome and encouraged to work alongside them and act as one of them, but for her benefit, not his. And then he provides for her. In verse 9, he instructs her to drink the fresh water provided for his employees. In 14, he invites her to dine with his workers. And in 15, he instructs his workers to purposefully drop stalks of grain so that she can pick up more full, intact barley to take home. And then he protects her. He instructs every man in that field to keep their hands off. Unfortunately, it was pretty common for the poor, a lot of times young widows, to be taken advantage of in situations like this. But not today. Not Ruth. Because Boaz was an upstanding man of God, and he's impressed with what he's heard about this young woman. Take a look at verse 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground and asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you richly be rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So news about Ruth has traveled fast. And apparently this kind of sacrifice was pretty astounding. And so Boaz sees Ruth's covenant kindness and he pitches in some of his own. And when Ruth returns home that evening, she has quite a tale to share with Naomi. Verse 19. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." And so we end chapter 2 similar to the way we ended chapter 1, with contrast. But these contrasts hit a little different. Because in the beginning of the chapter, the women were empty, but now they are full. Ruth was a seedless woman, but now she has garnered an absurd amount of seed from Boaz's field. When last Naomi spoke of God, it was in curses, but now she is calling down blessings. These women had absolutely nothing, but now they have security for the next several months because Ruth has been invited to stay on and glean until the end of the harvest. This is so good. It's hard to believe that there could possibly be more, but there is. Chapter 3. We see that the harvest has now come to a close. And at this point, Naomi has decided she has got to find a home and a husband for Ruth. And so we see Naomi lay out this plan for Ruth that includes some customary ways of washing and dressing and acting in order to make her availability known to Boaz. And there's a lot here that I don't have time to explain, but if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into the story of Ruth, we actually have a whole next level series just on this book alone, so I encourage you to check it out. But for now, here's what I want you to notice. In chapter 2, Naomi called Boaz a guardian redeemer, and the Hebrew word for this is a goel. This means the closest relative responsible for any kind of familial redemption. Now, what does that mean? We see a little bit more about the responsibilities of a goel in Leviticus chapter 25. Here's what it says. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and has to sell their property, the nearest relative is to come and to redeem what they sold. Now, Naomi might also be referring to the law of levirate marriage that we talked about in a previous session. The law that says a brother of a man who dies without a child should marry the widow and give her a son so that his brother's name is not blotted out from the history of Israel. But here's the thing. Boaz is Naomi's closest relative, not Ruth's. And there's really no reason for Boaz to marry Naomi because she's older and she's beyond childbearing years. And so the lawful redemption is really unnecessary in this case. So now, here in chapter 3, it's several weeks later, and Naomi tells Ruth that she wants her to go to Boaz on the threshing floor in the middle of the night and see if he will marry her. But her language changes. Chapter 3, verse 1, look at what she says. Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." And her instructions go on from there. See, this time, Naomi doesn't call him a guardian redeemer, but just a guardian, just a relative. Because the guardian redeemer would redeem Naomi, but Naomi's not interested in her own needs. She's interested in Ruth being cared for. But look what Ruth says to Boaz later that night. Verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." She says, "Goel." But that's not what Naomi wanted her to say. Naomi wanted the legal part left out of it. In other words, Naomi wanted herself left out of it because a goel would save the family of Elimelech. A goel would save Naomi. But again, just a guardian, just a relative, he could save Ruth. But that's not what Ruth wants. She wants her mother-in-law taken care of. It would seem that she's again calling Boaz to a similar higher level of obedience, just like she did the first day they met in the field. There's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. And once again, covenant kindness is at work. Because these two refuse to look out for themselves, and demand to take care of one another. Both Naomi and Ruth will be taken care of together. Boaz goes on to tell Ruth that he would gladly grant her request. But there is another relative who's actually closer. But Boaz promises to have a conversation with this man the following day. So one way or another, it seems that redemption is coming. And so Ruth returns to Naomi once again with both good news and more grain, and they wait for the sun to rise to see how this will all play out. So in the final chapter of the book, Boaz meets the other guardian at the town gate, and he tells the man that Naomi's land needs to be redeemed. And at first, the guardian redeemer is all in. But then Boaz adds this in verse 5. He says, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Okay, so why the change in tune? Well, being a guardian redeemer means that you gain more land, which means more profit, right? But the reality is that being a guardian redeemer also has a cost. Think about Elimelech's land. What's happened to it all this time that they were away? Well, because there was this terrible famine, it probably means it's been sitting there dormant the entire time, which means it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of manpower, and a lot of resources to get it back up and running. Now, all of that's totally worth it if the land will belong to the Redeemer in the end, but not so much if it has to be passed on to someone else. See, if this wife, Ruth, who is also being redeemed, if she bears a son, that son will not fall in line with the Redeemer's other sons. This son will actually take the place of the previously deceased husband. This means that any inheritance that grew for the Redeemer in marriage will now shrink if a son is born. And so this means that he not only lost the resources of that redeemed land, but he dwindled the resources of his own because he took those and put those in the redeemed land instead of his own. So you can see, accepting the position of a guardian redeemer, if there is a fruitful widow in play, is not exactly a savvy business proposition. And Boaz knows this, of course, but he does it anyway, because chesed. Now look at verse 9. Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." And the town rejoices. References are made to Leah and Rachel, the matriarchs of Israel, and they're made in regard to Ruth. Essentially, these people are calling her mother, almost as a prophecy. Now you'll notice they also reference Tamar. This would have been less common in marriage and family blessing, but it's likely that they're drawing a comparison between these two women, both widows, both outsiders, who were made insiders. And then look in verse 13. It says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth.' Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, 'Naomi has a son.'" Naomi has a son. Look, this is not just rejoicing over an heir by way of a grandchild. This is the Levirate law fulfilled. Ruth gave herself as a surrogate, and this was always the plan. It was Elimelech's land, it was Elimelech's name, and it is Elimelech's widow that Boaz was redeeming. Ruth just offered her womb to make this happen. A broken womb, but a willing one. Her final act of chesed. So Obed is born, and he's placed in Naomi's arms, and it says she is the one who cared for him. And from Obed comes Jesse, and from Jesse, David, a grandson, who interestingly enough wrote many psalms about his dark nights of the soul and wondering if God had abandoned him. pretty reminiscent of his grandmother, Naomi. But a grandson who also has the blood of a brave, intelligent, and faithful woman flowing through his veins, Ruth, a woman who had the courage to believe that nothing is impossible for God, even facing a giant. Well, like I said in the beginning, thinking of this story as just simply a romance is pretty off base. But make no mistake, it is a love story. Covenant kindness was poured out by Naomi onto Ruth. It was poured out by Ruth onto Naomi, and it was poured out by Boaz onto both of these women. And that same covenant kindness is poured out on all of us through another of their grandsons, Jesus, the Christ. Some redeemed property, others redeemed possessions, but our guardian redeemer gave us the salvation of our souls. And what a gift it is for Ruth. What a privilege for this broken, sonless, foreign widow to have her story remind all of us of the greatest act of chesed any of us will ever receive.